In those days is a phrase that we hear a lot in the Advent and Christmas readings that we come across this time of year. Some examples. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree, Luke says at the beginning of the Christmas story. Here, earlier in this 21st chapter of Luke, we hear how dreadful it will be in those days when Jerusalem and the temple will fall. In those days and at that time, I will make a righteous branch sprout from David's line, Jeremiah prophesied. In those days. But what about these days? Here we are at the start of another Advent season, getting ready for another Christmas, and we're hearing the same stories again and again. What do they have to say to us in these days? In these days that can seem bleak. In these days, we have breaking news of a newly identified Omicron variant of the COVID-19 virus, and scientists are concerned that perhaps its many mutations might make it less vulnerable to our current means of defense. In these days, there is continuing violence in our world and even in our own country, as we hear of parades being mowed down by cars and cities like my beloved former stomping grounds of Philadelphia breaking records with 500 homicides. In these days, people of color continue to be dehumanized even after they are murdered. In these days, we get devastating diagnoses and news of tragic deaths. These days can be terrifying. And then when we read passages like this Sunday's gospel reading, we can be terrified all over again, because this is apocalyptic language. This is end of the world stuff. And apocalyptic language like we find in the book of Revelation or the book of Daniel or this part of Luke's gospel, it's famously unsettling. It is grand in scale and inevitable in tone. It depicts something utterly beyond human control. Here, Jesus tells us about signs in the sun and the stars, roaring seas that will distress the nations. He tells of people fainting, or to be more literal, stopping breathing because of fear. This startling imagery is designed to grab the attention of the hearer, and I think it succeeds. But as with all apocalyptic literature, it can be heard in different ways. It can be terrifying, yes, but it can also show glimpses of God. Kathy Beach Verhey makes this point beautifully by using the famous Van Gogh painting, The Starry Night, as an example. You may be familiar with it, with its deep blue background and bright orange and yellow swirls of starlight and a town sleeping quietly below. Now, depending on how one looks at it, Van Gogh's vast, swirling, fiery circles on a deep, dark blue night sky can look like something from the end times. Rather than stars, they look like meteors, like balls of fire falling toward the earth. But there is also a steeple in the center of the town. There is a sense of tranquility, of peace in the town. And when you focus on that, the vibrant yellow and orange spheres are bringing light to the weary world below. It all depends on how you look at it. Beach Verhey points out that the same is true of what Luke's Jesus is saying. Like Van Gogh's great painting, Luke's apocalypse elicits different reactions from those who admire it. Frightening, bold, and beautiful glimpses of God. This is what Jesus offers on this first Sunday of Advent. Our vantage point makes all the difference. And the vantage point that Luke invites us into is one that is, as the sci-fi hero Doctor Who might say, all wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey. I don't know if anybody gets that reference, but it's okay. Here, the future and the past are all mashed up in the present. And this seems odd except for the fact that we experience how time can be inconsistent. Think about how long one more sleep until Christmas felt when you were 5 or 6. It seemed like the day would never come. And now, as an adult, if you are an adult, think about how it feels to hear that Christmas is just 27 days away. Talk about scary things. I'm not ready. It might as well be tomorrow for how fast that time will fly. And as we experience this Christmas, it will also inevitably be all mashed together in our minds with Christmases past, whether we want it to be or not. Time is wibbly-wobbly indeed. And time is all jumbled up here in this passage from Luke. After all, Luke is writing this gospel after 70 AD, when Jerusalem's temple did, in fact, fall. But just before our passage, he relates Jesus predicting that it would happen. Now, the first hearers of this knew that it had already taken place, but Jesus is shown predicting it anyway. And Jesus refers to this generation, making it seem like all of these signs were imminent, even though some of that precise generation who lived when Jesus was speaking had already died or were aging rapidly when Luke was writing. It's a very strange treatment of time, but perhaps it is so because Luke is inviting us to look at things from a different perspective, the perspective of God's time. This is saying that there is something important in the past and the future for the present moment, whether Luke's or ours. And that is often how it works with God. To quote Audrey West again, she writes that in God's Kairos time, past and future are woven together for the sake of today. God's time is the now and not yet that reshapes the world's present expectations and our own. Advent is, at its core, all about this now and not yet of God's time. Jesus has already come into the world. We aren't actually waiting for that event to happen, and I loved this truth as a kid when I used to use it to justify why I thought I should be able to listen to Christmas music starting as early as August. Jesus is still born, I would say to my minister father, thinking, yeah, let's see him push back on that one. But in all seriousness, Jesus has already come. And that's the good news that we celebrate at Christmas. Jesus is God's entering into human history in a unique way. But in Advent, we are still waiting for something. We are waiting on Christ's return, something we Presbyterians don't really spend a whole lot of time talking about. But we are awaiting the arrival of the Son of Man, as Jesus calls himself. We are waiting for him to return and to usher in what began at his first coming, the fullness of God's reign. We are waiting, here, now, in these days. Advent reminds us that the past, present, and future are all bound together because all of time is held in God's hand. And that perspective makes all the difference for how we hear these words of Jesus. Now, Jesus notes in his own teaching that there will be different reactions to the signs in the sky and on the earth. He says that nations will be distressed at what is happening. Individuals will faint with fear at the fundamental shaking of everything they know. But the disciples are to have a different response. They are told to stand up and raise their heads. They are not to be bowed down with fear or turn away from the trouble because they have a different perspective than the world. They know the promises of God, and they know the God they have met in Jesus Christ. They experience those events and read those signs quite differently. They grasp their significance as people whose frame of reference is guided by Israel's scriptures, particularly as these have been interpreted for them by Jesus. They see the same things as everyone else, but formed in relation to Jesus' message, they see with different eyes, Joel Green wrote. Jesus calls his followers to see with different eyes. He calls them to respond to the shaking of the heavenly powers and the instability of the worldly powers with courage. He calls them to respond with hope the kind of hope that we celebrate on this first Sunday of Advent. So what does that hope look like? Jesus is not telling his listeners to have a Pollyanna, just think positively and everything will be okay kind of hope. There is a place for positive thinking, but there is also such a thing as toxic positivity, a kind that is just blind optimism that overlooks and disregards anything negative. And that kind of positivity doesn't really help anybody or anything, and that is not what Jesus asks for. Jesus tells them to lift up their heads, to stare straight into the depths of the falling stars and the roaring seas, and to be not afraid. It's the kind of hope that propels fights for civil rights against huge odds. It's the kind of hope that will not let legislation stop people from providing water to migrants in the desert. It's the kind of hope that changes the world. One of my favorite scholars, Willie James Jennings, writes about this kind of hopeful reaction that Jesus commands in his commentary. He says, "Such actions are not examples of insanely blind faith or tragic denial of destructive forces. They suggest the recognition that our lives are in the hands of a God who has taken back from death and destruction the power to determine our future." God has taken back from death and destruction the power to determine our future, and so we can have hope. It's a hope that is not just based on promises for the future either. It's a hope that is firmly anchored in the past, in God's redemptive action throughout history. And Jesus also gets at this point when he gives this parable of the trees. He says that when the trees begin to sprout leaves, when there's that tiniest little bud, we know that the fruit of summer is coming. And we know because it's happened before. Audrey West says that when buds begin to form on barren trees, we are confident that winter is ending and summer will arrive. Why? Because we have previously lived through a change of seasons, or because others have told us of their own experiences. As Jesus' followers, we have the stories of God's faithfulness to Abraham, to Israel, to God's chosen people, to all creation. And we have evidence of that faithfulness in Jesus Christ. Emmanuel, God with us, God who loves and laughs and weeps with us. We have Jesus, in whom God overcame death and all its forces in the world. This is the firm foundation on which we base our hope. And the hope that is built on this foundation is the kind of hope that makes these days livable and fuels us for the work that lies before us at the start of this new year. At the end of this teaching, Jesus warns against letting hearts be weighed down by the worries of the world. Now, Luke's audience could rightfully be weighed down. After all, the Jewish and Christian community was scattered even further afield than it already was when the temple fell, and they had plenty to be worried about in the Roman Empire. But we too have plenty to be worried about. As I said before, these days can be frightening. But Jesus reminds us of the one thing that can keep our hearts from being weighed down by it all: the Advent vantage point of hope. Hope that sees God's faithfulness in the past, God's activity even in the midst of chaos, and hope that knows that redemption is coming. When I asked the Wednesday Bible study group this week about if they could think of any examples of what living with this hope looked like, they pointed out that we have an example right here. This community. This church and so many other churches and communities around the world have lived with hope in the face of a global pandemic. You had experienced God's faithfulness in the past, and you did not run from the troubles of the present, but you lifted up your heads. You found ways to keep worshiping, to keep caring for one another, to keep learning, to keep serving. That is hope. These days are difficult. There is too much making the world perplexed and fearful. And we cannot bury our heads in the sand, and we cannot stop our ears to the cries of others. If we did that, we would be denying the very message of Christmas, that God is with us. But where others may see cause for despair and fear, we are called to see where God's redeeming love is breaking in, and when we see it, we can join it. So my prayer for us in this Advent season is that we will hear Jesus' charge again, to not let our hearts be weighed down, but to pray, to keep awake, and to go into this broken and fearful world with real hope. Because this fearful world is where Jesus will be found. This weary world is where God's kingdom has come. And this beloved world is where our redemption is drawing near. Thanks be to God. Amen.